So Ron, you and I have never met, and we've just shared some brief emails together, although I have seen some videos you did about 8 months ago on Jordan Peterson, and I actually thought those were some of the best, especially at that point in his exposure, some of the best commentary on in terms of orientation on who he was and where he was coming from. But I didn't know anything about you, and I still don't know much about you. So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Oh, well, I teach in British Columbia, University of the Fraser Valley, in the Department of Political Science, Philosophy, Religious Studies. I have been teaching for about 30 years in the area. It's in the central Fraser Valley, just a little east of Vancouver. I was on staff with Amnesty International in the 1980s. So those were very busy years. My interest in Peterson and many other people like Erasmus, for example, comes from the fact, sadly, so too often people rise on important issues and the ability to be self-critical and also to see the other person's perspective. And then, so that's a fairly
Yeah, you're breaking up quite a bit. Let's go back to Amnesty International. Where did you serve in Amnesty International?
Well, I was Pacific Director throughout the late 1980s, early 1990s. Okay. And then I chaired part of the Middle Eastern program for Amnesty International for Canada. Okay. And so obviously when you're dealing with human rights issues that Amnesty deals with, you're usually the people who are working for the victims of two political ideologies that can't seem to see outside of their own agenda, and then people who are trying to think a little bigger, a little more meaningful, act for justice and peace concerns, they become the victims of these clashing ideologies of the left and right.
Yeah. So now you're teaching, and I noticed it's in political science, religious studies, and what was
philosophy.
Philosophy. That's all one department?
Yeah, so it's a big humanities. It's I mean, classical education usually at its best brought together political philosophy, philosophy itself, and religious studies was always a part of what it meant to think meaningfully about the human condition and the relationship with theology, philosophy, and what that means in public responsibility and public life. So political science or elements of that are political theory or political philosophy.
Okay.
In that sense, it's just the old classical humanities brought together in a department in which many departments have fragmented into little silos of distinct disciplines. We've tried to maintain a more classical approach to education, which is grounded in historic humanities.
Yeah. Well, I've never heard of a department doing that, but I very easily see the reason for it and the wisdom behind it. As a pastor, part of what I enjoy is, I'm a master of no discipline, but I touch many of them because you're dealing with whole people and whole situations. So early on, go ahead.
Yeah, well, obviously from your position, you're dealing with the wide range of human experience, which crosses any academic discipline. When you're with the human journey, people inevitably dip into particularly a religious background, theology, but then how we think about wisdom is very important, how we think about public life, how we deal with the tragic and unpredictable things. I mean, you have to be very interdisciplinary to be a pastor.
Yeah. I also noticed while I was, before I met with you, that you've done a fair amount of writing on religion. Do you identify as a Christian? Do you participate in a Christian or a religious community?
Yeah, I come from the Church of England, or in Canada, it's Anglican, or in the United States, to be Episcopal.
Okay.
Yeah, so my roots, I come from a family, some of bishops and priests and scholar bishops, and go back to the, what's the Anglo-Canadian tradition that I was sort of with my mother's milk. Christianity and its moderation, its breadth, its richness, its both its Catholicity on one hand, and the other hand, its respect for the Lutheran, the Reformed sides as well. It's always tried to be Catholic but not Roman, and Reformed but not schismatic, and it's never an easy balance to walk.
No.
But that's part of the genetic code of the Anglican way.
Okay. Well, I think that's, nobody's ever quite put it that way to me, but I think that's really helpful to me, and it's what I've seen in some of the Anglicans whose work and writing I really respect. Now in some of the earlier videos that I had seen, you talk about Peterson. You mentioned that he started coming up a lot from students, and I've heard this. I know a number of academics who first, Jordan Peterson first came on their radar because their students started talking about him, and you mentioned students wanted to write papers about him. How did all of that unfold for you?
Well, I think, I've been teaching 30 years at University of the Fraser Valley, and I've never had more students interested in one living person as Jordan Peterson. And then that goes from wanting papers, wanting to do class presentations. I've been presently editing a book on Jordan Peterson. We hope to have all the essays in by December, but I've also asked about 6 students to reflect and say 1,000-word essays on why are they drawn to him? What is he speaking into culture where there's a lack or there's a void? And how is he doing it in a way that sort of wins and woos them in a meaningful manner? So yes, I would say definitely I was aware of him in the broader Canadian cultural issue before students began to sort of get on the horse and ride it. But certainly the growing number of students who are attracted for diverse reasons to Jordan Peterson I don't think there has been any other person on the Canadian public scene who has drawn that many people in that short a period of time.
Yeah.
We have larger public intellectuals in Canada like Charles Taylor and George Grant, and there's many others, but none quite as thoughtful, but as popular at the same time.
Okay.
Not populist in a thin or shallow sense, but right. Popular in that he takes important ideas, makes them accessible, but also speaks into the void in our culture in terms of where it's polarized politically, and says you need not go right nor left. There's a nimble center here if we're going to be thoughtful, but people on the right or left who usually are frozen or embalmed in intellectual positions, they either caricature them, for depending on what side you're at, which says a lot about the low level of intellectual discourse.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I've noticed is that a number of academics, at least, I think about, probably get in trouble, but why not? You get to a certain age and you don't worry about getting in trouble so much. But James K. Smith on Twitter, a number of individuals. He's a philosophy professor at Calvin College. I don't know if you're familiar with him. But I heard in him, and I've heard a number of other academics speak pretty dismissively of him, that it's just this moment. The impact is too shallow. The content he's putting out is unworthy of attention from an academic. And so it's interesting to hear your take on it, which is also my own. How deep this will go in time, none of us, of course, know. But it was my opinion quite early on that his work, and especially the phenomenon around him, deserved attention. Do you get pushback from other academics as you poke around at this?
Well, one predictable means that certain intellectuals or academics use to dismiss someone is they say he's thin, he or she is populist, they lack a certain depth, they're speaking to the people who are not trained, good university degrees. That's a bit of an ad hominem argument. Peterson be approached in a variety with the popular Peterson of 12 Rules for Life, and there's a more sophisticated of Maps of Meaning. It's a bit just look at, say, Lev Tolstoy, just children's stories, and say, well, he's not a particularly profound thinker. Well, read War and Peace, or Anna Karenina, or Resurrection, or some of his more, or Erasmus himself. You could read his adages, his more, simple stories or parables, or you say the thing with Jesus too. This guy isn't too, well, there's more to him than that. So a lot of it depends on what you're reading, how you're reading. You'll learn more about any thinker. Now, any good thinker will write and speak at a popular level, but there's also the more sophisticated, and the task is to follow the markings or the cairns of the popular to the sophisticated, rather than dismiss someone because you just stop and linger at the markings or the cairns of the popular. But that's a typical academic way of not engaging someone. You just dismiss them. They're populist. There's a lack of depth. There's a lack of sophistication, or they're just surfing the wave of a trendy cultural issue, and then you just, with a wave of the hand, curtly dismiss someone. And I find that reaction more superficial than their critique of what they see as the thinness of Peterson. Does that sort of make sense? Or?
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Now, when we started talking about talking, you brought up a name that, I've touched on in a few of my videos a little bit, mostly with respect to the Reformation and Martin Luther and kind of setting up the Reformation. You brought up Erasmus in this conversation with Peterson, and I thought that was extremely interesting. Now, I would dare bet most of the people listening to my channel have very little idea about who Erasmus was and why he's important. So could you give us a little bit of background on Erasmus and the significance of him within the story of Western culture and the church?
Well, I mean, this would be just a stone skimming the surface of the water, sort of whistle-stop tour, but I mean, Erasmus is probably one of the most significant public intellectuals of the 16th century. He, as it's often said, he laid the egg that Luther hatched. And his retranslation of Jerome's Vulgate really brought the text forward in a much more sophisticated, updated, textual manner. But he also, along with Luther, for example, and many Roman Catholics, including what was called the Oxford Reformers, John Colet and Thomas More himself, were very critical of the Roman Catholic Church, its aberrations at the level of theology, public life, liturgy, centralization of authority, in Rome, the injustice it was perpetuating. So he was ahead of Martin Luther in terms of critiquing the Roman Catholic Church. And Luther was quite drawn not only to Erasmus's retranslation of Jerome's Vulgate, but also his rigorous critique of the Roman Catholic Church. So at a certain point, it looked like Erasmus was going to be the forerunner and the pioneer and the morning star of the Reformation. Where they broke really was Erasmus held together as a good Catholic, both loyalty to the church, but criticism of the church. And this is where, at a certain point, Luther could go down a path of criticism, but then schism, fragmentation, and the emergence of new denominations in Protestantism itself. The other thing which I find which would be appropriate, sort of Erasmus then and now, Erasmus saw both interpretations of the Bible and then the application to real life situations. There was a certain level of ambiguity and uncertainty. And so this was his big clash with Luther. Luther would often argue that sola scriptura, I'm for the Bible alone against the Catholic Church with its traditions, and yes, the Bible's there, but it's councils, its synods, its various reads. And Erasmus could say to Luther, he said, we're on the same page when it comes to the authority of the Bible. Our debate is not about the authority of the Bible. It's about the authority of the interpretation of the Bible, or what we call deuterocanonical authority. I tend to see that there's various ways of reading certain texts, and of course Erasmus had done magnificent work on the fathers of the church, both East and West. Yep. And so he understood that in troubling texts, whether Romans or Galatians, epistles, Revelation, there were various ways of reading a text, and the tradition itself reflected that. Whereas Luther, from Galatians and Romans, he just said, this is the key, this is the esse, as it were, of the text, justification by grace to do. And Erasmus would say, yes, that's there. I'm not denying that that's there, but there are other texts which can give you alternate reads, and it's this multi-layered way of reading a text and seeing different voices, in this case in the New Testament. And so he accused Luther of reductionistic exegesis in that sense, or eisegesis, rather than allowing the text to come out in an exegetical manner. And so Erasmus, to his credit, this might be the third thing, is he refused to buy into either tribes, the emerging Protestant Reformation at the time, whether Lutheran or Reformed or Anabaptist, Mennonite, or various forms, each convinced their interpretation of the text was correct. And then because he continued to critique the Roman Catholic Church, and as it slipped into the Council of Trent and the whole Tridentine tradition, which polarized it against the Reformers, he refused to buy it, and then he got put on the index and was not taken off the index until Vatican II and Pope John the 23rd. And so he was an irenical thinker who was able to transcend the tribalism of any of the clans or denominations or theologians of the time. And he would say sort of yes and no to each of them, but he was too thinker, both politically, theologically, exegetically, to sort of buy into any, and he was always trying to harmonize and say, listen, you all see, but you, St. Paul, you see through a glass darkly. So don't absolutize your own perspective, because that will just continue to fragment the church and the Catholic and Apostolic Church. And so in that sense, he's an interesting forerunner, because his context was one is fragmentation and ideology, in his case, theological, exegetical, denominational, and a similar one sense to Jesus. Okay, he's got the Pharisees, he's got the scribes, he's got the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes, but he didn't buy into any of their agendas. And so where does a wild bird like that fit? It can't be caged. Does that sort of make sense? Or
yeah. Now it's interesting to me. I was a few months ago, or maybe it was a couple of years ago. The older I get, months and years start to come together. But I was, doing a deep dive again into Luther, and going through a biography of him, and just noting again how Luther posts these 95 theses in Latin in order to spur some theological conversation. It gets translated by some of his students and put out to pamphlets in German, which of course is going to have a different political effect. And in reading the biography of Luther, I noted how, in a sense, Luther seemed to have the type of temperament that when you pushed him, he pushed back. And then you pushed harder, and he pushed harder back. And you see Luther over time, his views getting increasingly extreme. And that's where, in many ways, the contrast with Erasmus gets interesting, because obviously Erasmus decided early on, he's not gonna fight the Roman Catholic Church. He's gonna keep his peace with the institution, and he's going to work his agenda of reform from the inside. Whereas Luther, you've got the Diet of Worms, you've got the politics of the Holy Roman Empire going. All of that just pushes Luther. The harder they push on him, the more he pushes back. The politics get engaged. His political agent, squirrels him over at a castle. He doesn't want to see him get taken out. But actually, when I was, later on, coming into the Jordan Peterson conversation, seeing temperamentally more of an alignment between Luther and Peterson, and that it's often the case that Peterson begins talking as an academic. He's qualifying things, and then someone pushes on him, even with the pronoun incident that really launched him into public life. And I'd watch people push Peterson, and every time I'd see that, I'd think, I have a brother-in-law from Manitoba, and so I've got a sense of these Northwestern Canadians, and you get the sense listening to Peterson, boy, if you push him, he's going to push back. You push him more, he's going to push more back. And so actually, I was thinking more in terms of Peterson and Luther be just in terms of temperament, but you're making an argument that there's something to be learned about Peterson by looking at it from the lens of Erasmus. So how do you see that?
Well, what I would say there is that for Peterson, like Erasmus, there are various ideological tribes lined up. Now, we are just in many ways secular Lutherans or secular Puritans. The idea of ideology has never stopped. It just gets now translated into politically correct issues, politics of the left and right. So it's just the secularization of Protestantism, but the idea of ideology continues. Now, just as Erasmus in the 16th century was willing to critique the Roman Catholic Church, both in its pre-Tridentine form and certainly, well, he had died before Trent began, but then he was put on the index for that. He would also be willing to critique Luther. Obviously, Calvin came a little later from that, but he didn't buy into either of the tribes, in this case, theological or denominational. Jordan Peterson is, much the same. He gets launched, or the craft leaves the cove with his critique of what was going on in terms of politically correct speech. He doesn't, and of course, there's a whole ideology back of that. That's just the tip of a very, very large intellectual iceberg of progressive liberalism or trendy liberalism. In that sense, which claims to be, on the one hand, open-minded and about diversity and tolerance and pluralism, but it's as closed-minded often as the alt-right that it critiques. Now, Peterson, of course, if a person thinks of either or, right or wrong, it's sort of a Manichaean way of thinking, light, darkness, good, bad, then the alt-right picks him up and says, well, if he's critiquing the trendy left, he must be on the right. But Peterson's is critical. He's too sharp a thinker to buy into the alt-right and its reactionary tendencies. And in that sense, he shares in an Erasmian way of refusing to buy into the ideologies of right, left, or even sensible center in that sense. Now, as you rightly say, sometimes when you're cornered, the sword comes out and you start dueling. And so as a temperament, you've got these two things. He's transcending ideology like Erasmus. And to what degree can Peterson, like Erasmus, maintain an irenical approach in the midst of the conflicts? And what degree does he get drawn into the conflict and become part of a problem rather than part of the solution? Does that sort of make sense? Or?
Yeah. The big news this week on Peterson has been the tweet where he weighs in on the Brett Kavanaugh drama, and he sends out a tweet. And I noticed that it's often, as is often the case with any combustible news bit, it's without the conversation between Brett Weinstein and Eric Weinstein, which Peterson is in a sense following, and Peterson just puts out a line out there that basically says, well, if Kavanaugh should step down if he is appointed, and that then sets off a firestorm within this whole Jordan Peterson tribe. And when I listen to your take now in terms of looking at Peterson via Erasmus, that then seems to make more sense of Peterson even though he gets adopted by these tribes, he is going to try and maintain his independence from them, and in fact be willing to say things that may alienate allies and tribalists that align themselves behind him.
Yeah, if a person uncritically genuflects before a tribe and its chieftains, and there's a whole agenda here, if you dare criticize it, you must be on the other side without saying, no, it's quite possible either to critique a tribe I'm in and still belong to it, or critique it and not be on the other side as well. And I mean, Peterson sees himself in some sense as a classical liberal, and elements of classical liberalism are about classical liberalism comes out of the terrible religious wars of the 17th century, whether we're talking about, John Locke and later on Mill and 19, people like this. They were very wary of, they recognized clearly that we are finite and fallible, which means we see through a glass darkly. And they saw the implications either religiously, 16th, 17th century religious wars and the tragedies which emerged, or you secularize that, just the fragmentation of different intellectual families. And once you start from the premises we're finite and fallible, it means we see in a limited way. And so classical liberalism has tended to hold high an aspect of it in terms of critical thinking. And that's quite, and this is the irony, is that a lot of the, say on the left, they see themselves as liberals, but when you critique them, you must be on the right. So to me, I've often, it's not very liberal of a liberal not to critique liberalism. But when someone comes to do it, then they must be on the right. And you want to say, no, you can do it within liberalism itself, because critical thinking is a part of that heritage and tradition. Yeah. And in that sense, Peterson is just emerging. You get this implicit religious thinking, and it'd be interesting to see where he goes, and particularly works in the Bible and other things like this. I mean, he's in a journey, as anybody is, as they're trying to make sense of the pilgrimage through history and time. That's just part of what a thoughtful person does, and it's not easy given, all the different perspectives out there, theologically, denominationally. But in that sense, his classical liberalism puts him in a place in which he's confronting liberals who are not liberal anymore, because they've frozen in terms of how they're dealing with the hot button issues in the culture wars. And so rather than saying, he's really a part of classical liberalism, why don't we welcome his critiques? They just dismiss him as being on the alt-right. And so in that sense, when liberals dismiss them, they're not very liberal, because they're denying the importance of critical thinking.
Yeah.
And I think, again and again, he's come out and said, one source I'm drawing from, and draws from many others as well, myth and, historic thought, Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard. I mean, there's many other sources, but one of the many sources he's drawing from is classical liberalism. Yeah. And so it's ironic that often the people who oppose him the most are liberals, when in fact the very organ or faculty he uses, critical thinking, is part of that liberal tradition itself. And how does that sort of make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Now, one of the interesting things about Erasmus to me is his, as you mentioned earlier, in the context of this Renaissance humanism that turns into, that continues to go throughout Europe, this enchantment with the text and the classical Latin and learning Greek, and Erasmus comes and offers a fresh translation of the Bible in Latin, and for us today who are awash, who are awash in biblical translations, but in that time, for him to offer a fresh translation of the Latin that in certain elements challenged translations of particular texts upon which Roman Catholic dogma had been built, that was a very revolutionary, and especially for his time, gutsy thing to do, because as you can see in the Martin Luther case, doing things like that could lead to a chain of events that get you killed. And so how does that piece fit into your picture?
Well, certainly with Erasmus, his critiquing the Vulgate, the Roman Catholic conservatives turned, because it was like for many people in the 50s, the King James equaled, the authentic text itself, rather than seeing this as just a, more modern interpretation. And there's other ways of translating a text itself. So on the one hand, sure, what Erasmus was doing, he was calling into question almost 1,000 years of an established text in Latin, the Jerome Vulgate. And he said, there's problems, serious problems, because, Erasmus had the languages. This is why he adored Jerome even more than Augustine in some ways, because Erasmus was a textual critic. Augustine was an exegete, but also philosopher as well, theologian, obviously. But so Erasmus was very interested in Jerome because they were philologists. They were scholars of language. And Jerome, like Erasmus, knew the Latin, knew the Greek, knew the Hebrew. But for conservatives who said this is the established text, then what Erasmus was doing, he was upsetting almost 1,000 years of Catholic established, authority. And this is why the new reformers that were coming along, Erasmus was their key guy, because if the reformers, the Bible was really central to their thinking, and legitimately so in the 16th century. But then the question was, whose translation of the Bible can we trust and why? And offering not only alternate translations, but alternate reads or exegesis of texts as well. And so that threatened to undermine at a textual level people like Luther and many reformers. There had been earlier reformers, but they lacked the sheer sophistication of Erasmus in terms of scholarly training. And so he was like a Mount Everest in terms of languages and translations. And there were lesser translators, but in Erasmus. And then not only did he just dwell, as it were, in the world of translation, but he was an activist. He was very interested. So what's the relationship of this text to life in the church, life in politics, life of liturgy, life of peacemaking, war and peace issues? His confrontation with Pope Julius and many others was that these were war hawkish popes, and you could find no justification for this type of aggressive religious nationalism in the Bible. This is why
you froze.
The emerging Anabaptists.
Okay, go back a little bit. Talk about his conflict with the Pope, because you froze right there, and that's a pretty key area.
Yeah, Erasmus's clash with Pope Julius, who was very much a warlike pope. He argued very, very clearly that you use the Beatitude Sermon on the Mount and loving the enemy and walking the extra mile with those who persecute you. And he actually, one of his colloquies, he has the Pope coming after his death to heaven, and he meets Peter, and Peter won't even allow the Pope in. And very significant. And so this would have come as an affront to faithful Catholics, that here's the Pope, the vicar of Christ. And Erasmus was very clear. And these are his popular stories, his colloquies. There's many, many colloquies. And then his aphorisms are tales for children, or parables as Jesus would do them. He didn't live in a sort of a scholarly ivory tower. He was always asking, what's the relationship of my translations, my exegesis, to the pressing issues, both for an average parishioner and the issues they're facing, but also at the very sophisticated levels of theology and the major universities and seminaries in Europe at the time. So he was always going back and forth between theory and praxis and theory, application, and but grounding it solidly in the best of the text as interpreted by the fathers and then applied to 16th century conditions, which gave him a real authority, because he wasn't just talking about a private experience. He wasn't just talking about a tradition. He wasn't just talking about the Bible. He was looking at Bible, the best of the tradition, because the fathers didn't always agree on stuff, East and West, and he looked at the dialogue within the tradition as they tried to make sense of difficult, and then applying it in 16th century context. And so it gave him a certain authority, rather than just say a reformer of the Bible, or certain reformers. Not all reformers, just the Bible. They would look at key thinkers, Augustine, Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Calvin, Bernard of Clairvaux in the Institutes is very important, Bernard. So Erasmus nailing the authorities to the wall when they claimed to, speak for the church or for Christ, and they were doing the very opposite in their thought in life. So it warmed him to the reformers, because this was the reformers' agenda.
Yeah. Why do you think Erasmus, in a sense, could get away with this in a way that Luther couldn't?
I think you've got two different temperaments, and also two underlying ways of seeing. So for an Erasmus, as I mentioned earlier, he believed there were certain non-negotiable things. One was loyalty to the church. That doesn't mean you were uncritical. And so his argument, you could not reform the church if you left the church. no more than in political parties. If you leave a party to reform a party, you're just splitting either the right or the left politically. He was also more ironical than Luther as a temperament, so he was often confronted. But he would respond at his best in a more, okay, so how can we work these things through together? I want to hear where you're coming from exegetically, theologically, politically, liturgically. So he had a mind that was more nimble. That's why I sometimes refer to the Peterson thing, whereas Luther, this was the way you interpret. If you differ with me, as it were, you're the devil. So it's throwing the ink against the devil in that sense.
Yeah. Most of my introduction to Erasmus, even though once I say this, I know some of my friends are going to listen to this in the Reformed camp and say, you got to stop listening to Brad Gregory and his work on, because every time I mention him, some of my friends and Reformed historians say, don't listen to Brad Gregory. Gregory's vision of Erasmus was that he was not only Irenic in that he was seeking peace, but he was also much more of a gradualist, imagining that over time the church will reform, whereas as Luther, even in terms of his conversion moment with the thunderstorm in the woods, I mean, Luther was much more apocalyptic in that, it is now, it is black and white, it is cut and dried, and this must be, now is the day. Whereas Erasmus is much more, we'll keep working on it. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Erasmus was ironical and incremental, trying to have the big picture over periods of time, whereas for Luther, it was a black and white way of seeing. If you disagree with me, then you're compromising the faith, you're a Judas, and we have to bring the Reformation as soon as possible. So very, very different temperaments, very, very different ways of seeing how reform takes place, very different ways of approaching the Bible, very different ways of dealing with those who differ with you. This is why the person who followed Luther was Melanchthon, who realized pushed a dualistic either-or way far too hard. And Melanchthon was trying to build a bridge between Erasmus and Luther. And of course, Luther was none too impressed by that, because Luther came to detest Erasmus when Erasmus would not follow him. I have a whole couple of chapters in my book on Erasmus, Wild Bird. And he could be very nasty rhetorically. And, he would use the most hateful language towards people who dared to differ with him, almost as if he equated his own interpretation with God. He almost was God on earth, he becomes the new Moses of the Reformation. Yeah. And those are criteria of cults in some ways.
Yeah. Well, and Luther has that quality in that when, at least my reading, this isn't from Gregory, but from others, that Luther thought that, here's the Bible, and we're going to apply reason to the Bible, and it will be self-evident to everyone, my interpretation, and we'll all together follow. And then he's a little bit struck when Karlstadt and a good many others, they're doing like Luther, but they're coming out with different interpretations. And, what do you mean? And so, then suddenly Luther has enemies on many sides, not just the Catholic side. And it sounds like, but go ahead.
Yeah, one of the, I think, ironic things about what we call particularly religious conservatives today, they tend to see liberalism emerging in the 17th, 18th century, whereas in fact liberalism is birthed with the Reformation. And Luther is going to appeal to liberty and equality. And these are actually, Erasmus noted, he said, 1517, of the Christian man. And Erasmus principles, then the reformers, each using those principles, are going to interpret the Bible differently, because Luther just thought his interpretation was the only one. Right. But of course, you hit the Calvinists, you hit the Lutherans, you hit the Anabaptists, and then the question is, okay, we all hold the authority of the Bible as sacred, but we're all interpreting and applying it differently. So now what becomes the authentic Christian interpretation of the text? Whereas the classical Catholics, of which Erasmus came from, he said, be wary of allowing those principles, the genie out of the bottle, because they're going to go in a variety of directions. And there's going to be nothing that is, finally you get someone like Yates, center cannot hold, mere anarchy is. And they saw very clearly the Protestant Reformation was the birth of liberal anarchism, with everyone becomes authority in terms of their own denomination. And if you disagree with that authority, you start your own denomination. And it proliferates like rabbit warrens in that sense. And so, yeah, this was a shock to Luther. He thought, well, you know, everyone's going to be on my side. Well, no. And Erasmus warned him about that. And in the clash between Erasmus and Luther on exegesis, it was very clear that there are different ways of exegeting a text. Both one is very simplistic, reductionistic, i.e. Luther, and the other is more nuanced, refined, looking at layers weighed as you listen to the voices of the mothers and fathers of the church in the patristic and medieval era. And so, yeah, so that whole birth of those principles in the 16th century, late 15th century philosophy, voluntarism and nominalism, Erasmus was acutely aware of where those principles would lead when applied by people like Luther and others in the 16th century. And so his commitment to loyalty, yes, critique, yes, do good biblical exegesis, yes, read the heart, but it's done. You can't say you're reforming the church if you leave the church and start your own denomination. That's not going to reform anything. And so he was astutely aware. Once Erasmus, he said essentially to Luther, the Bible really is not your source of authority at the deeper level. Your real source of authority is the rights of the individual. You see fit.
You cut out just at the wrong time in that one. The rights of the authority is the source of your rights of authority are the individual.
Yeah, the rights of the individual, all being equal, using their freedom as they see fit in good conscience to interpret the text. Each person who apply those principles to the text, they're going to interpret the content differently. And was the real opposition to the Reformation is that it was where it was going. The centuries.
Yeah, you're just cut out there. And now so there'll be some gaps in it, but bits and pieces I can usually pick up what you're saying, unless you're frozen now too.
No, I hear you.
Yeah. Okay. You know, it's interesting because again, when I'm thinking about Peterson and Erasmus and Luther, one of the differences, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know, Erasmus took great offense at the when I say militant, I don't mean that as a metaphor. The Pope's leading armies. Erasmus also did not fit in a monastic lifestyle. Luther was a monk and a professor, and then a pastor, and obviously a church leader. Whereas Erasmus stayed a scholar and never was responsible for leading a congregation or as a leader of a group of people. That will also in many ways afford a certain amount of, let's call it, you can leave a certain number of things kind of in solution there in the ether, whereas it's often, if you're the leader of a movement, you have to make decisions. Okay, I might see all of this variability and flexibility, but this is what I must do now, and that's a difference. One of the things, if we I mentioned, you noted Charles Taylor. One of the key insights I picked up from Charles Taylor in A Secular Age was the idea of the reform going from a two-speed system where you had monks and spiritual athletes who could be the great saints, and then you had common people who it's kind of a nature grace dichotomy where they'll muddle through and they won't know too much and they're not too bright, but they'll live off the spiritual excess and the excess merits of the saints, and the system will be okay. Whereas the Reformation comes through and very much, we're looking at a one-speed religion. And that, of course, via Calvin, in Calvin's Geneva, I mean, we're looking to make, the entire city the city of God. So, where is Erasmus in that? Because it sounds like in many ways, with many others who didn't leave the Roman Catholic Church, he's working at reform from within. Is he much more of a one-speeder, or does he still recognize the two-speed?
Well, I would say with Luther and Calvin, he would share the importance of the laity. This is why a lot of his work was written for your average, thoughtful person. So this is why I think people like struggles with the clerics, the bishops, archbishop, various. He's a very much a part of that bridging the clerical lay, arguing that at one point he would also, to some degree, argue, in fact, it's the clerics and sometimes the monks who have so deformed the faith that's led to cynicism amongst the laity and a longing for something. I mean, he was very critical of the monastic tradition. He knew it well. Yeah. And he knew the monks and he knew the monasteries and he knew the he wasn't critical of all of them, but he realized there was a lot of duplicity going on there. Hence his desire, like Luther, like a Calvin, like the Anabaptists, to say this has to make sense to the average layperson. And I'm going to write books that speak to the average layperson in their journey. I can also do the sophisticated stuff if you want, and he did that. He was, he was a creme de menthe writer at the highest level, high mucky mucks, in that sense. So he shared. I would also say you're right that he didn't have a parish, but his parish was Europe. And some people are called to the bigger parish and to reform the bigger story, which. That didn't mean that he could avoid difficult issues. Erasmus was in the thick of the fray throughout his whole life, particularly as he began to mature. So the tensions that the pastor or the priest or rector of a parish may have, some of those decisions, in principle, he had to struggle with exactly the same issues, just at a bigger level, with the leaders, the makers, the shapers of Europe. Of what he saw, and he was in that sense a spiritual Abba to many of the emerging leaders within Europe at the time. And so many came to him and sat at his feet, and many, of course, opposed him, Luther and others. As I mentioned earlier, many of the early Anabaptists, when he was forced to go to Basel, and then the Reform movement in Basel challenged him, he had to go to Freiburg. But many, they deeply respected what he was trying to do. So, very much, as you're mentioning, unlike Taylor, Erasmus would argue, the monastic tradition was pretty corrupt, and I know it well.
Zoom just failed us for a big unlike Taylor. Erasmus says the monastic movement is pretty corrupt. I knew it well, and right then I dropped you. And I really want to hear what you have to say.
I mean, the danger is sort of, as Taylor would say, you idealize the monastic tradition as those who are sort of the ascetic mountain climbers who are doing the real work, in your laity, well, they'll find their way, but we're not, and they can, live off the merits of our work. Erasmus would say, well, that's just simply not true from a sociological perspective. he knew the monastic world. There were good abbots, there were good monks, but there was also a lot of duplicity at and that's part of where Luther comes along, or Calvin comes along, or the Anabaptists come along and say, yeah, you talk about this, this more elevated life of the monks, the ascetic tradition and spirituality, but there's a lot of duplicity there too. And if we're going to reform the church, it has to bring together both lay and clerics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's not as simple as, sort of the monastic life is more developed, more mature, more sophisticated, whereas the laity, they'll never quite get it. But you have the sacraments for them, and give them a little bit of food that'll keep them going. But we're on the high octane fuel as monks. Yeah. Erasmus wouldn't buy into that dualism. Yeah, in that sense, he's.
Now it's we're going about an hour, so I want to land the plane here. But as this conversation has developed, I've just you've kind of opened up. I'm thinking, okay, you got Jordan Peterson and where he's at and all of that thing, and then we've got Luther and Erasmus here, and been dinging up a lot of points on the Luther side, but some of these last ones on Erasmus side, because one of the interesting things that has fascinated me about Peterson has been, what will he do with respect to institutions? Because he's been, tremendously critical of the academy, and he's been making noises about, doing an online academy where we can get some kind of credentialing and some kind of accreditation so that, there can be some things. And so in that way, he's in a sense going his own way. But, unlike his colleague who said early on, because when he said it in the speech that he wrote, he looked to buy a church. When I read that, I thought, of course he looked to buy a church. But now, in a sense, he's a celebrity pastor, and he doesn't need a church anymore because he's much more of an itinerant evangelist going all over the world with his little book tour. And if you've ever been to any of his little book tour events, it's not a book tour, it's an itinerant evangelist who works out his gospel message at each venue and continues to tinker with it. That way, as a preacher, I can very much understand him. But now Peterson, with respect to institutions, seems much more Erasmian in that whereas it's clear, I mean, if you watch Peterson at one of his evangelistic crusades, after the show, for those who have gotten the VIP access, you get to go forward and shake hands. And myself and some of the psychologists who are with me in my meetups have noted, just with a great degree of awe, actually, how he can work a line of 150 people, and for the 30 seconds or a minute or two that he has with these people, really give those people his undivided attention. As a preacher who shakes hands with people after the service, I was in awe of what he did there, because that is pretty amazing. But now Peterson is trying to touch individuals' lives. He's got his individualism, but he's looking at, alternate to the university, but he's not setting up the Billy Graham Evangelistic Crusade organization. He is kind of continuing to live as a scholar, above things. He's not starting the Petersonian Church of Toronto. So where do you see that in either the Erasmus reflection here, or just your thoughts on Peterson on this matter of institutions?
Well, I would say if he breaks from the important role of universities and tries to, because in one sense, universities have just become the new secular churches in that sense. And if he and the professors are your new priests in that sense. So if he breaks from U of T, where he has taught, in that sense, he shares more of that Lutheran DNA or genetic code. I'm not being listened to, I'm being opposed, I've tried to reform, it hasn't worked, I have to start my own institution. In that sense, he would be much more Lutheran, and part of that Albertan context from which he grew up is very, very much Republican in that sense. We as a province are distinct from the rest of Canada, and I won't have time to go into that Albertan tradition of the Mannings and where our own right of center conservative parties emerged. That's part of his part of his origins, and part of unpacking that would also be interested if he does sort of leave U of T and start his own, I think. Yeah, I would say what he shares with Erasmus is a nimbleness of thought at an intellectual level. He doesn't buy into the ideologies of right, center, left. He shares a liberal respect for, critical thinking, both of the right or the left. Now, what he does with that institutionally will, at a sociological level, will return whether he's more Lutheran, because really just secular Lutheranism just fragments into different communities, institutions, in that sense. I'll keep in this. There's a mother lode. There's much good in it. You stay within it. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah.
I do hope Peterson does stay within universities, because
Nope, you just dropped out there, and I really want to hear. I know my audience is really going to want to hear what you have to say right there. You do hope he stays within university.
Definitely. I think it's absolutely essential he stays within university life, because the thinking, the challenges within universities are very significant for the future of students, for a culture, for a civilization. And to break from that, he loses that whole momentum and that whole richness that university life offers. And he's following more a Protestant trajectory, almost an Albertan trajectory. And so I hope he has the maturity to realize that universities are absolutely foundational. Yeah, he may disagree with them, but Erasmus disagreed with the Roman Catholic Church, but he didn't leave it. And so Peterson could play a very significant and pivotal role in opening up a broader forum of discussion in public universities if he stayed within them. If he leaves, that game's over.
Yeah.
And that would be a tragedy intellectually and culturally.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because just looking at what he's done with this, this supposed book tour, this is the biggest non-book tour I've ever seen. It's really a road show. And I do wonder how he can come back to the university in terms of, just the size of his following. Okay, so you're going to roll in his class. Well, how? Because you're going to have all of these individuals who are going to want to be in his class. They're not university students, and so, and it's in this sense that the questions of the form and the institution of university as educational deployment system versus what happens when you get a guy who's now become, a popular icon. And we'll see what happens with his popularity too. But there's a lot of interesting questions that I have no idea where any of this is going to go.
Yeah, and there's the tragic flaw, I think, of Luther, and many of those followed him, is they did not know how to work within complex communities, in their case, the church, so they find their own denomination. And as a result of that, we just get multiplicity of denominations. But underneath is a certain way of seeing reality. If I interpret reality right, you disagree with me, you can't be reformed, I start my own tribe. I hope Peterson is not just a clone of Luther in that sense, a secular Lutheran who doesn't know how to work within the wealth of good university life and the complex nature of discussion. Yes, there are problems. Yes, there's political correctness, but there was in the Roman Catholic Church too that Luther faced, Erasmus faced. And the way they dealt with it was based on two different ways of seeing reality and how you work within historic institutions. And I think he'll become a lesser person if he leaves, and it will also feed into a reactionary mentality. I think there is potentially more in him than that, but he dig deeper into his soul to find it.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful. And we're at about an hour, so I'm going to stop the recording, but don't go away. And but I've sure appreciated this, Ron. This has been fascinating, and I've thought about Peterson and Luther, but I never thought about Peterson and Erasmus, and kind of the contrast between Luther and Erasmus kind of add some interesting colors to this entire fascinating Peterson episode that we're still very much in the middle of.
Yeah, well, he's part Erasmus and part Luther, and it depends what part is going to sort of drive the chariot of his future.
That's right. That's right. So thank you so much. And again, stay on. I'm just gonna stop the recording.